Greetings bibliophiles and welcome back to The Book Thing. Today I'm going to be looking at a novel by an author I've actually covered on the channel before, and it's I think the first time that's happened, maybe, or is it not the first time that's happened? I might have actually read or covered a couple of Ian M. Banks books in that time. I'm actually just checking that now. No, I don't think I have. No, actually, no, I tell a lie. Yes, I have. Okay, I've covered two Ian M. Banks books that I can remember. But yeah, the author this time around, however, is John le Carré. And last time it was Our Kind of Traitor that I covered, which was one of his much more recent books. This time around, however, it's classic le Carré. We're jumping right back to the height of his Cold War spy fiction. In fact, one of his Smiley novels even, with the Honourable Schoolboy. Now, there are 8 Smiley novels in total, and I say 8 Smiley novels. There are 8 novels in which the character of George Smiley appeared, but not all of them were really about him. At least 3 or 4 of those were ones where he just made an appearance as a minor supporting character in some way, like, for instance, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, where he kind of turns up at the end and we just get a little name check of George Smiley. There are 3 novels in particular that are really focused on Smiley, however, which it doesn't even have a particular name, this trilogy. It's either known as Smiley versus Carla or The Quest for Carla. And personally, I just call it the Smiley Trilogy, but it's all about Smiley and his arch rival in the Russian, the KGB, and the 2 bookends, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and Smiley's People, are both very good, very entertaining books, and there actually have been multiple adaptations of all of them. And the best of these is definitely the 2 BBC TV adaptations. But there was also a film of Tinker Tailor starring Gary Oldman, which was, it was okay. But I will take Alec Guinness any day as George Smiley. He is, to me, the quintessential screen portrayal of George Smiley. And I don't think anyone's really done it better than him. Even though there's not been that many actors, but he just is just George Smiley. He is George Smiley. So, anyway. In the middle book, however, The Honourable Schoolboy, that's only ever been adapted for radio, I believe. And I did wonder for many years why it wasn't included in the BBC's miniseries, or the series that they did. And it turns out the answer was money. And this is me, as a complete aside from talking about the book. We're just going to start off talking about this instead. But yeah, a lot of the action in The Honourable Schoolboy takes place in the Far East. And it apparently would have just been too expensive because they would have had to simulate, wars in... Because it covers various war zones at various parts, up to and including South Vietnam and Cambodia as well. So a bit beyond the BBC's budgets for the time, basically. So for many years, I kind of was aware of The Honourable Schoolboy, but I'd never read it, I'd never seen any adaptations or heard any adaptations of it, and so it's only within the last when did I even finish reading this? I can't remember, not that long ago, within the last however many months it took me to read this, that I finally actually have gotten around to it, because I read Tinker Tailor and Smiley's People a fair old while ago. We're talking like a couple of years ago at this point, and I just never got round to reading The Honourable Schoolboy, but I didn't seem to have been missing much by having missed it out, even though it's the middle one of the trilogy. And now, having read it, I can say, yeah, I definitely wasn't missing much. I'm going to say that right off the bat. This is an entirely unnecessary book to appreciate the other 2. It does give some interesting detail about stuff that happens in between Tinker Tailor and Smiley's People. It fills in some gaps, but doesn't stop you enjoying Smiley's People. And you can jump straight from Tinker Tailor to Smiley's People and you get what's going on. You know everything that's kind of, relevant that's gone before, more or less. And all that really happens in The Honourable Schoolboy is you get some sense of the reconstruction process that goes on after the events of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Now, I'm going to avoid spoilers, as I always do, but basically what happens in Tinker Tailor is there is a Russian mole, as it turns out, at the heart of, we'll call it MI6 for simplicity's sake. He always refers to it as the circus in his books. And it's the process of uncovering that mole, discovering who it is, and the end of Tinker Tailor, it deals with some of the repercussions from that, but that's much more fully explored in the Honourable Schoolboy, the aftermath of the uncovering of this traitor. I'm not going to say who it is, because that's a fairly major plot point of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. So we've had all this. We've had this traitor who's brought the service low, who has uncovered, you know, all of their networks and all of their assets and just basically blown the whole gaff. And it comes down to George Smiley to put this shattered thing back together again. And it's not even guaranteed that it will be put back together again. It starts off the book by kind of heavily implying that, well, you know, it might just get folded up completely. The whole thing might just get, like the responsibilities might just get divvied up amongst other departments, or they might just start with a fresh slate and, you know, create some new intelligence apparatus out of whole cloth. So in some ways it's interesting filling in the gap, because it you know, like the entire plot that happens is, you know, we get to the conclusion of the book and it's like, okay, all the things that have happened here explain how we get to where we are in Smiley's people. But as I say, you don't need any of this to understand what's happening in Smiley's people, because going from Tinker Tailor to Smiley's people, it's a bit of the old Herman Melville there, with George Smiley as Ahab chasing after the white whale, i.e. Carla, and you really only need to have read Tinker Tailor and to get to Smiley's people and to really appreciate it. So yeah, I didn't miss anything, basically, by missing out on the Honourable Schoolboy for so many years. And having read it now, I can honestly say it's not one of his better books. It absolutely is not. It's not bad. There are certainly worse ones he's written, but the thing about le Carré is, and I went over this to some extent in the video / podcast on Our Kind of Traitor, where a real strength of his is his characterizations, the people he comes up with to populate his little plays. But sometimes he wants to make even the bit players characters with a capital C. Sometimes he goes too far. Sometimes it goes round to a point where actually it almost becomes a little bit of a parody of itself. And that's kind of what happens in this book. It's not the only flaw of the Honourable Schoolboy, but with the exception of Smiley, who remains a relatively low-key character. That's one of the key characteristics of Smiley generally, is that he's a very understated person. He's very he keeps what he's thinking to his chest. There's a good word for that, and it's escaping me. Anyway, yeah, he's not a chatty. He's not a big personality that fills a room. He's a quiet, commanding personality. But the rest of the minor characters in this, that's where it kind of blows itself out. And the other main character, because it's not all about Smiley. Smiley is a main character, but it's not the main character. The other main character in this book, Jerry Westerby, he just ends up being a parody, and you're not even quite sure what he's supposed to be a parody of. And there's a lot of the more minor characters as well, where you just wish they would, be normal people instead of these. I don't know. It's almost like you're watching some not very good soap on the telly, and everybody's trying to outdo each other by being even more hammy than the actor that came before them. And it has that quality to it of people just overacting, and it's a bit distracting when you're trying to read a book and it just comes across like that. It seems very false somehow. And it's not the only le Carré novel where that is true, but it just it seems a bit odd, you know, this one in particular, that being a problem with it, because it's not, for me anyway, an issue with Tinker Tailor, and it's definitely not an issue with Smiley's people. They managed to be just restrained enough. They were just on the right side of not seeming like a kind of self-parody when it came to the kinds of characters that were involved. And I think if he'd just been a bit more restrained, if he'd had one or two of the you know, just a couple of the more minor characters be these big personalities, but it feels like every single minor character has to stomp across the page and make their mark, and some of them are only in for, you know, like literally half a chapter, but for some reason he decided that every single character had to try and equally make an impression on you by just being big and expansive and taking up the room. And Smiley almost feels, it kind of ends up feeling like the odd one out, if anything. There's one of the other minor characters where you could kind of say that as well, where you don't kind of learn very much about them, but they're just, I don't know, like you get some very, very minor characters that just end up being window dressing if rather than anything else, and you know, you don't really get anything about them at all. But that's an unusual thing in this book. Most of the characters are not like that. Now, as for the plot itself, well, as I say, it starts off with this slow, careful reconstruction, and as we go through it, you know, we get the reactivation of Westerby, who is sort of semi-retired. He's a journalist, but he's also a spy, and you know, the whole reason why they've gone to someone like him is that you know, they don't know who was blown, they don't know who was compromised, and so they reactivate somebody from years past who was only ever kind of a part-time spy. That's the impression the book gives anyway. Somebody they used from time to time, but wasn't, you know, somebody who fully worked for them. So they activate him, they send him off to investigate something in Hong Kong, where a lot of the action of the book takes. And they uncover various things along the way, and it all just kind of grinds and bumps along slowly, and we get various character developments and various plot developments until we get to the end. And I don't know, like, the plot itself is a bit problematic, and the end of the plot is certainly not that satisfying, but I could have lived with the ending of the plot, I think, if the characters involved, as I've said, were a bit less loud, a bit less shouty from the page. And even then, it still wouldn't have been a great book, because the structure of it is incredibly uneven. The pacing of the plot, how it's all doled out to you, the reader, is frankly a bit weird. I got to about page 200 and I thought, okay, finally something's starting to happen. Finally the plot is starting to kick in. And then more or less immediately felt disappointed, because that wasn't actually the case at all. And then I think I felt the same thing somewhere 300 plus pages in. And then I thought, no, wait, hang on, that's not really it either, is it? So it's weirdly paced in that regard. It's hard to say, oh yeah, it's a 3-act story. I don't even know how many acts this story has, but it's a hell of a lot more than 3. So I honestly, like, just on that basis alone, I talked about adaptations earlier, you would have to do some really serious chopping up and moving around of various plot elements to get it to be coherent on a screen. And certainly if you're trying to even, you know, compress it to the length of just a film, you would have to chop a lot out, because it's meandering. And I think he just... And again, you know, this is almost ties into what I was saying with the characters, where he got so taken up with this idea of everybody has to be a big character. All of the locations, all of the places that we go have to be just overwhelming and in your face, and it's just, he almost, it feels like he's throwing in different locations, not because it serves the plot, but just because he thinks it'll be interesting to have these places as a backdrop for various bits of the action, and it ends up feeling completely unnecessary. So, I mean, in a way, it's interesting to have, you know, a fictional account of a reporter's view of the end of the Vietnamese War, or the conflict in Cambodia, and there's a bit of stuff about insurgency at the time in Indonesia, and there's various things also that happen in Hong Kong, but he's a bit too, I don't know, I think he just got a bit too carried away with it all. It all was a bit unrestrained, and it ends up feeling like quite a flabby book in some ways. Not in a sense that it's overly long, but in a sense that it feels very directionless, very rudderless for quite a lot of it. And I think partly that's purposeful, because they spend quite a lot of time just slowly, excruciatingly slowly, peeling back the layers of the plot until finally we get to an understanding of what exactly is going on. But the process of getting there is just, it's not a fun read. It was a bit of a tedious read in places. I kept thinking to myself, okay, surely it's going to get interesting at some point, and it did in places. You know, there were bits I enjoyed. I don't want to make it sound like this is a really terrible book and you should not read this, but having read Tinker Tailor and having read Smiley's People, honestly, the most damning thing I can say about The Honourable Schoolboy is it just feels completely unnecessary. Nothing would have been lost if this book had not been written, and it would have been a little bit less of the Smiley story, but it wouldn't have been anything important that we'd have been missing, because all the important bits happen in Tinker Tailor and Smiley's People. So, yeah, he's le Carré's most interesting character, and he's le Carré's most famous character, but this is not really a book that adds much to him and adds much to his mythos, I guess. And so, although it's not a terrible book, it's kind of hard to recommend it, because it's just so awkward. It's just, it takes so long to get anywhere. It's so meandering, and the characters, especially one of the central characters, are so self-parodying in a lot of ways. It just, I don't know. It's not a good le Carré novel. It's definitely not one of his top ones, but it's definitely not one of his worst ones either. So the bit I'm going to read out is from the start of chapter 3. I did struggle a bit to decide what the passage was going to be. There was a later one where Smiley's interviewing somebody to try and find out some background, and it was very, I felt it was very indicative of what I've been talking about, of the rampant theatricality, where even minor characters that you only see for this, you know, part of a chapter end up being a little bit over the top. But in the end, it decided it was way too long. It was going to be, you know, pages and pages and pages. And so I've gone for a slightly shorter passage instead. Only George Smiley, said Roddy Martindale, a fleshy Foreign Office wit, could have gotten himself appointed captain of a wrecked ship. Only Smiley, he added, could have compounded the pains of that appointment by choosing the same moment to abandon his beautiful, if occasionally errant, wife. At first or even second glance, George Smiley was ill-suited to either part, as Martindale was quick to note. He was tubby and in small ways hopelessly unassertive. A natural shyness made him from time to time pompous, and to men of Martindale's flamboyance, his unobtrusiveness acted as a standing reproach. He was also myopic, and to see him in those first days after the Holocaust, in his round spectacles and his civil servant tweeds, attended by his slender, tight-mouthed cupbearer Peter Gwilym, discreetly padding the marshier bypaths of the Whitehall jungle, or stooped over a heap of papers at any hour of the day or night in his scruffy throne room on the 5th floor of the Edwardian Mausoleum in Cambridge Circus, which he now commanded, you would think it was he and not the dead Russian spy, missed out the name there on purpose, who deserved the trade name Mole. After such long hours of work in that cavernous and half-deserted building, the bags beneath his eyes turned to bruises, and he smiled seldom, though he was by no means humorless, and there were times when the mere exertion of rising from his chair seemed to leave him winded. Reaching the upright position, he would pause, mouth slightly open, and gave a little fricative before moving off. Another mannerism had him polishing his spectacles distractedly on the fat end of his tie, which left his face so disconcertingly naked that one very senior secretary, in the jargon these ladies were known as mothers, was on more than one occasion assailed by a barely containable urge, of which psychiatrists would have made all sorts of heavy weather, to start forward and shelter him from the impossible task he seemed determined to perform. "George Smiley isn't just cleaning the stable," the same Roddy Martindale remarked from his luncheon table at the Garrick. "He's carrying his horse up the hill as well. Ho ho!" Other rumours, favoured mainly by departments which had entered bids for the charter of the founded service, were less respectful of his travail. "George is living on his reputation," they said after a few months of this. "Catching the mole was a fluke. Anyway," they said, "it had been an American tip-off, not George's coup at all. The cousins should have had the credit, but they'd waived it diplomatically." "No," said others, "it was the Dutch. The Dutch had broken Moscow Centre's code and passed the take-through liaison. Ask Roddy Martindale." Martindale, of course, being professional trafficker in circus misinformation. And so back and forth, while Smiley, seemingly oblivious, kept his counsel and dismissed his wife. They could hardly believe it. They were stunned. Martindale, who had never loved a woman in his life, was particularly affronted. He made a positive thing of it at the Garrick. "The gall! Him a complete nobody and her half a Sawley. Pavlovian, that's what I call it. Sheer Pavlovian cruelty. After years of putting up with her perfectly healthy peccadillos, driving her to them, you mark my words, what does the little man do? Turns around and with a quite Napoleonic brutality kicks her in the teeth. It's a scandal. I shall tell everyone it's a scandal. I'm a tolerant man in my own not unworldly way, I think, but Smiley has gone too far. Oh yes." For once, as occasionally occurred, Martindale had the picture straight. The evidence was there for all to read. With the mole dead and the past buried, the Smileys had made up their differences, and together, with some small ceremony, the reunited couple had moved back into their little Chelsea house in Bywater Street. They had even made a stab at being in society. They had gone out, they had entertained in the style befitting George's new appointment. The cousins, the odd parliamentary minister, a variety of Whitehall barons, all dined and went home full. They had even for a few weeks made a modestly exotic couple around the higher bureaucratic circuit. Till, overnight, to his wife's unmistakable discomfort, George Smiley had removed himself from her sight and set up camp in one of the meagre attics behind his throne room in the circus. Soon the gloom of the place seemed to work itself into the fabric of his face, like dust into the complexion of a prisoner, while in Chelsea Anne Smiley pined, taking very hardly to her unaccustomed role of wife abandoned. "Dedication," said the knowing. "Monkish abstinence. George is a saint, and at his age." "Balls," the Martindale faction retorted. "Dedication to what? What was there left in that dreary red-brick monster that could possibly command such an act of self-immolation? What was there anywhere in beastly Whitehall, or, Lord help us, in beastly England, that could command it any more?" "Work," said the knowing. "But what work?" came the falsetto protests of these self-appointed circus watchers, handing around, like gorgons, their little scraps of sight and hearing. "What did he do up there? Shorn of 3/4 of his staff, all but a few old biddies to brew his tea, his networks blown to smithereens. His foreign residencies, his reptile funds frozen solid by the Treasury," they meant his operational accounts, "and not a friend in Whitehall or Washington to call his own. Unless you counted that loping prig Lacon at the Cabinet Office to be his friend, always so determined to go down the line for him at every conceivable opportunity. And naturally Lacon would put up a fight for him. What else had he? The circus was Lacon's power base. Without it, he was, well, what he was already, a capon. Naturally, Lacon would sound the battle cry. "It's a scandal," Martindale announced huffily as he cropped his smoked eel and steak and kidney and the club's own claret up another 20 pence a crack. "I shall tell everybody." Between the villages of Whitehall and the villages of Tuscany, there was sometimes surprisingly little to choose. Well, that last sentence there, that's a reference to the earlier part where we get introduced to Westerby, who he's basically extremely theatrical from the start, and he's definitely the most kind of self-parodying character, but I don't know, maybe it was a bit harsh earlier. I mean, that kind of, like, it's a big part of his facade is playing up the role of the buffoonish Englishman, and I don't know, I think it doesn't quite fit that well, but maybe if everybody else was a bit toned down, Westerby wouldn't just feel like such a little, I don't know, a cherry on top of everything else, if that makes any sense. I don't know, I can't really think of a better way to put it. So, yes, the Honourable Schoolboy. You can skip this one. Go read Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Go read Smiley's People. You don't really need to read this. And even if you don't particularly want to read any of them, I can definitely, as I said at the start, recommend the BBC adaptation starring Alec Guinness, because it's fantastic. It really is. And it captures all the high points and doesn't really miss out anything important. So, yeah, maybe at some point somebody will attempt this, but who knows? I don't think we're missing much by not having a good adaptation of it. So that's it for this edition of The Book Thing. Hopefully you found it useful, enjoyable, educational. If you did, you can leave any comments below. You can check out my gaming channel if you haven't already. You can go and listen to this on SoundCloud. You can find a link to that below. And as always, stay tuned for more.